The city woke under a low gray sky, and the streets moved with quiet tension as people sensed that something important was about to happen. Samir Hale walked toward the old courthouse with slow, steady steps, and his mind carried memories that refused to rest. He was once known as Royal Guard, a nickname given during his years of service because he stood watch with patience and calm at high-level events. Samir was not famous and he never wanted to be, but today his name filled phones and news screens across the city. The reason was a lawsuit that sounded unreal even to him as he held the papers close to his chest. The papers said he was suing a powerful political figure for $100 million, and that number felt heavy like a stone. For Samir, the money meant nothing, and what mattered was the truth that had followed him into sleepless nights. He remembered the first day he saw the man who would later stand on the other side of the courtroom. That day was bright and loud and filled with cheers as the politician spoke with confidence and promise. Samir stood near the stage watching the crowd and doing his duty while believing he was guarding something honest. Years passed and Samir left his post to live a quieter life in a small apartment with simple routines. He worked modest jobs and avoided attention and thought his past was behind him. One evening while cleaning old boxes he found a sealed folder marked with a date he recognized. Inside were notes and records from that public event along with private details that never reached the crowd. Samir felt a tightness in his chest as he read slowly and carefully. The words suggested actions and decisions that did not match the image the politician showed the world. At first Samir thought there must be a mistake and he closed the folder and walked away. Days passed, and the silence grew louder, and the truth pressed against his thoughts. He tried to ignore it, but every news clip and speech reopened the wound. Samir spoke to no one and kept the folder hidden as if it might disappear on its own. But one night he dreamed of standing guard again while people behind him whispered warnings he could not ignore. When he woke he knew silence was no longer possible. He sought legal advice from a small office far from the city center and spoke carefully. The lawyer listened without interruption and asked only a few questions. After reviewing the documents, the lawyer leaned back and said this could change everything. Samir felt fear and relief at the same time because a path had finally appeared. News of the lawsuit spread before Samir was ready, and strangers began to watch him closely. Some praised his courage while others questioned his motives. He stayed calm and avoided public words because he wanted the truth to speak on its own. On the morning of the first hearing, Samir arrived early and sat alone on a wooden bench. He watched sunlight move across the floor and reminded himself why he was there. Across the room the politician entered surrounded by aides and legal voices. The room felt smaller as attention pulled toward both men. Samir did not look away because he believed looking away was how silence wins. When the case was called, the air changed and every sound felt sharp. Samir stood when asked, and his voice remained steady as he confirmed his name. He explained that he was once tasked with protection and that duty shaped his values. He said he came forward not from anger but from responsibility. The judge listened without expression, and the room remained still. Outside the courthouse crowds waited and rumors moved faster than facts. Some believed this was the start of a collapse while others believed nothing would change. Samir left the building knowing this was only the beginning. He walked past cameras without speaking and felt the weight lift slightly from his chest. That evening he returned home and placed the folder back on the table. He knew the next days would test him in ways he could not predict. He also knew that once truth steps into light, it does not easily return to shadow. The next morning the city felt louder as if every street had become a hallway full of whispers. Samir Hale woke before sunrise and stared at the ceiling while the sound of distant traffic blended with his thoughts. He knew part one was only the opening door, and now the real pressure would start to push from every side. His phone kept lighting up with unknown numbers and messages that carried curiosity and sharp questions. Samir did not answer because he had promised himself he would not turn the truth into a show. He made simple tea and stood near the window watching people hurry to work while his own life felt paused. Across town the politician sat in a clean, bright office with advisors forming a tight circle around him. They spoke quickly about public image and timing and headlines and how to control the next wave. The politician kept his face calm, but inside he felt the sting of risk. He knew the documents Samir held could damage him if they were believed by the public. He told his team to stay steady and to treat Samir like a man chasing attention. But in his private silence he wondered how much Samir actually knew. Samir met his lawyer later that day in a small room with old books and a humming fan. The lawyer named Nora spoke clearly and placed a thin stack of papers on the table. She said the court would demand strong proof and they needed a clean story that matched every detail. Samir nodded and opened the folder again with careful hands. Nora asked him to describe how he got the documents and why he kept them. Samir explained that the folder came from event materials that were meant to be stored but never properly collected. He said he kept it by accident at first and later kept it because he felt something was wrong. Nora wrote notes and asked him to focus on what he saw and heard with his own eyes and ears. Samir understood that truth in court needed structure, not just emotion. Still, he could not forget the feeling of betrayal that had grown in him each time he read the pages. The documents were not dramatic in a loud way, but they showed patterns and choices that raised serious doubts. There were schedules that did not match public timelines and notes that hinted at private meetings. There were messages printed on paper that suggested someone wanted a certain story to be hidden. Samir did not want to ruin anyone, but he also refused to pretend the pages did not exist. After the meeting, Samir walked out into bright daylight and felt eyes on him even in ordinary places. A man near a street corner stared a little too long and then turned away quickly. A car stayed behind him for several blocks and then disappeared after a red light. Samir told himself not to panic and kept his steps steady. That evening a news channel aired a segment with a bold headline and loud music. The host spoke about the lawsuit like it was a game and invited guests to argue. One guest said Samir was brave and another said he was trying to harm a public figure for money. Samir watched for a few minutes and then turned it off because the noise felt cold and careless. He thought about his old job and how he used to believe that protecting people was always honorable. Now he saw that power could shape stories as easily as it shaped crowds. Later Nora called and said the other side had filed a response. She said they planned to challenge Samir as unreliable and paint the documents as misunderstood. Samir felt anger rise, but he swallowed it and asked what they should do next. Nora said they needed witnesses who could confirm that the folder was real and that the event records matched. Samir remembered a former colleague named Omar who worked that day and knew the storage process. Samir had not spoken to Omar in years, but he found the number and hesitated. He worried that pulling Omar into this would bring danger and stress into a peaceful life. But he also knew the case needed more than his voice. Samir called, and when Omar answered, his tone was cautious and tired. Samir said he needed to talk about the old event, and Omar went quiet. Omar finally said, "Meet me tomorrow, and keep it simple." The next day Samir met Omar at a small diner with plain chairs and warm light. Omar looked older than Samir remembered, and his hands shook slightly as he stirred coffee. Samir told him about the folder, and Omar listened with a tight expression. Omar said he always suspected something was off because certain materials vanished after the event. He said he had seen senior staff rush to collect specific papers with unusual urgency. Samir asked if Omar would be willing to speak to Nora. Omar stared at the table and said he had a family and did not want trouble. Samir understood and did not pressure him, but he asked Omar to think about it. Before they left, Omar said one more thing in a low voice. He said there was another person who might know more, a former assistant named Lena. Omar said Lena handled schedules and had seen conversations that never entered official reports. Samir wrote the name down and felt the story expanding like a map he never wanted to explore. That night Samir returned home and found an envelope slipped under his door. There was no stamp and no return name, and his heart tightened as he opened it. Inside was a single page with a short message telling him to drop the case. The words were polite, but the meaning felt sharp. Samir sat on the floor holding the page and listened to his own breathing. He realized then that the truth was not only heavy, it was guarded by fear. He called Nora and told her about the letter, and she said to save it and stay alert. Samir promised he would, and after the call he stood at the window again. The street below looked normal with lights and parked cars and quiet footsteps. Yet Samir could feel the invisible pressure around him as if the city itself was watching. He told himself that fear was the final test that tries to stop people from speaking. He placed the letter beside the folder and made a choice in his mind. He would continue not for money and not for fame but because silence would cost him more. And somewhere across town the politician sat in his office reading reports and tightening his plan. He smiled for cameras during a public appearance and waved as if nothing was wrong. But behind the practiced calm, a question kept repeating in his mind. How far would Samir go and what else would he reveal? The days that followed moved slowly but carried heavy meaning for everyone involved. Samir Hale felt time stretch as each hour brought new thoughts and quiet worries. He stayed indoors more often and kept his curtains half closed while reviewing notes again and again. The folder on his table felt like a silent witness waiting to speak. Nora called daily and updated him on small movements from the court and the other side. She said the pressure would increase before the truth had a clear chance to stand. Samir listened and nodded even when fear brushed his thoughts. He reminded himself that fear was expected when important things were at stake. One afternoon Samir received a message from Omar asking to meet again. The message was short but serious and Samir felt a mix of hope and concern. They met at the same diner where the noise of cups and plates softened hard words. Omar looked tense and kept checking the door before speaking. He said he had thought deeply about their last talk and could not ignore his conscience. Omar said he remembered the event clearly and how certain papers were removed without record. He said he would speak to Nora but only if his family stayed out of the public eye. Samir thanked him with genuine relief and promised to protect his privacy as much as possible. Later that evening Nora met with Omar and recorded his account carefully. She asked him to describe the chain of custody and who had access to materials. Omar spoke slowly but with clarity and confidence. His words matched the timeline Samir had already described. Nora said this was important because it showed pattern not accident. As the case gained shape the other side responded with louder statements. Public messages painted Samir as confused and unreliable. Supporters of the politician repeated the same lines with strong voices. Some claimed the documents were taken out of context. Others said Samir waited too long to come forward. Samir tried not to read comments but they reached him anyway through whispers and screens. He reminded himself that truth often meets resistance before acceptance. One morning Samir stepped outside early to buy groceries and felt a strange calm. The sky was clear, and the air felt honest in a way words were not. A woman at the store recognized him and gave a quiet nod of support. It was small, but it mattered to him more than loud praise. Later that day Nora introduced Samir to Lena through a private call. Lena sounded nervous but willing to talk under certain protections. She said she worked closely with schedules and saw meetings that never appeared publicly. She said some conversations were marked private and later erased. Lena said she kept personal notes because she believed transparency mattered. Nora asked if those notes still existed and Lena said yes. Samir listened quietly knowing this could be a turning point. They arranged a secure meeting and agreed to move carefully. When Lena arrived she carried a small notebook worn by time. She opened it and pointed to dates and names that aligned with the event. The notes showed time gaps where public appearances overlapped with private meetings. They also showed instructions to limit distribution of certain materials. Nora reviewed everything and said this strengthened the case greatly. Samir felt a mix of relief and sadness because the truth was clearer now. He never wanted to see anyone fall, but he believed accountability mattered. News outlets soon sensed the shift and their tone changed slightly. Some hosts began to ask deeper questions instead of shouting claims. Others invited legal experts who spoke about patterns and responsibility. The politician continued to appear confident and dismissive in public. He smiled during speeches and spoke about unity and progress. Behind closed doors his team worked late and voices grew sharper. They debated whether to settle or fight harder. They worried about public trust and internal support. The pressure weighed on him more each day though he hid it well. Samir received another anonymous message telling him to reconsider. This time the words sounded urgent rather than threatening. Samir saved the message and shared it with Nora. She said it showed fear on the other side. As the next hearing approached, Samir prepared himself mentally. He practiced answering questions calmly and clearly. He reminded himself to focus on facts, not emotion. The night before the hearing, Samir barely slept. He sat quietly and thought about his years of service and quiet duty. He believed that guarding truth was no different than guarding people. The next morning the courthouse filled with more people than before. Cameras lined the steps and voices echoed in every direction. Samir walked inside with steady steps and met Nora near the door. She gave him a brief nod that carried reassurance. Inside the courtroom, Omar and Lena waited away from attention. The judge entered, and the room grew silent. Nora presented the additional witnesses and supporting records. She spoke with calm strength and clear order. The other side objected, but their tone lacked confidence. The judge listened carefully and took notes. When Samir looked across the room, he noticed a crack in the politician expression. It was brief but real, and it told Samir the truth was landing. As the session ended, the judge requested time to review the new material. The room buzzed as people whispered and exchanged looks. Outside the courthouse, the crowd reacted with mixed emotion. Some looked shocked and others looked thoughtful. Samir felt exhausted but grounded as he stepped into the open air. He knew the path ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time since the case began, he felt less alone. He understood now that truth grows stronger when shared. And as the city watched closely, the balance slowly began to shift. The final hearing arrived like a heavy wave that everyone could feel before it touched the shore. Samir Hale woke early and sat quietly with his hands folded as if he could steady the day by staying calm. Outside his window the city moved like usual, but he knew many eyes were pointed toward the courthouse. He drank water and checked his notes one last time while reminding himself to speak only what he knew. Nora arrived in a simple dark suit, and her expression showed focus more than emotion. She told Samir that the judge had reviewed the added records and would allow deeper questioning today. Samir nodded and felt his chest tighten for a moment, then he breathed slowly until the feeling eased. They rode to the courthouse in silence while the radio played soft news updates in the background. When they stepped out of the car, cameras rose like a wall of glass and light. Samir did not stop and did not speak and walked forward with steady steps. Inside the courthouse the air felt colder and every sound echoed. Omar and Lena were already there, and each gave Samir a small quiet sign of support. The courtroom filled quickly, and the judge entered with a serious face. The politician sat with his lawyers, and his posture looked composed but his eyes seemed tired. The hearing began with Nora speaking first and setting the timeline in simple, clear order. She explained how Samir found the folder and how Omar confirmed the missing materials pattern. She explained how Lena notes matched gaps between public timelines and private instructions. The other side tried to interrupt, but the judge allowed Nora to continue. Then the questioning began, and it moved like a careful blade. Samir answered about his work history and why he stayed silent for years. He said he stayed silent because he hoped the truth was harmless or misunderstood. He said he spoke up because the pattern was too clear and his conscience would not let him stay quiet. The other side tried to suggest he wanted money and attention. Samir stayed calm and said the amount reflected the harm to his life and reputation and the seriousness of what happened. He said he would have preferred a quiet resolution if the truth had been acknowledged early. The courtroom listened, and the room stayed unusually still. Then Omar spoke and described how the event materials were handled. He said he saw senior staff collect specific papers fast and without the usual process. He said he remembered feeling uneasy, but he did not understand the full picture at the time. The judge asked a few direct questions, and Omar answered with respect and steady words. Then Lena took her turn and held her notebook with careful hands. She explained that schedules were edited and certain notes were marked private. She said she kept personal notes because she feared the official record was incomplete. Nora presented copies of Lena notes and connected them to the public timeline. The pattern became clearer to everyone in the room. At that point, the judge asked the politician lawyer to respond with substance. The defense spoke about misunderstanding and context and said none of it proved intent. But the judge pressed for explanations of the timeline gaps. The defense struggled to give a clean answer. For the first time, the politician shifted in his seat and his calm mask looked thinner. After a short break, the hearing continued with a surprising move. The politician asked to speak. His lawyer looked startled, but the judge allowed it. The politician stood and faced the room with practiced confidence at first. He said the lawsuit was a distraction and that he had done nothing wrong. He said the documents were being twisted by people who wanted to tear him down. But then the judge asked a simple question about one private instruction in Lena notes. The politician paused, and the pause felt longer than it should. He tried to answer, but his words came out less steady. He said he did not remember the instruction clearly. The judge asked again and reminded him that memory should be strong on matters of public trust. The politician swallowed and looked toward his lawyer. In that moment, the room could sense the truth pulling at the edges of his story. Nora then asked permission to introduce one final item. She presented the anonymous letter Samir received and explained the timing and the message. She did not claim it came from the politician directly. She claimed it showed that someone wanted fear to silence the case. The judge accepted the item and noted it for review. The hearing moved toward closing statements. Nora spoke plainly and said this case was not about drama but about accountability. She said Samir did not chase attention and he tried to stay quiet until silence became impossible. She said Omar and Lena came forward at personal risk because their conscience demanded it. She asked the court to consider the pattern and the harm done. The defense repeated their claims and asked for dismissal. The judge listened with a steady face and then ended the session for private review. The courtroom emptied slowly with people whispering and shaking their heads. Outside the courthouse, crowds waited and the air felt electric. Samir stood on the steps for a moment and felt the sun on his face. He did not feel victory yet, and he did not feel defeat. He felt something quieter, a sense that he had done what he could with honesty. Days later the decision came. The court allowed the case to proceed and signaled that the evidence raised serious concerns worth full examination. It was not a final judgment on everything, but it was a major shift. News outlets reported it with strong headlines and serious voices. Supporters of the politician looked worried, and some allies began to step back. The politician held a press event and spoke about staying focused. But his words did not land the same as before. People had seen the cracks, and once cracks appear, trust becomes harder to hold. Samir returned home that night and sat at his table in silence. He looked at the folder and the notebook copies and the saved letters. He understood that the story was now bigger than him. He also understood that truth does not always destroy a person, it destroys the lie around them. Samir did not celebrate. He simply breathed and felt lighter than he had in months. He knew more steps would come and the road would still be hard. But he also knew that he had guarded something worth protecting. And in the quiet of his small apartment, Samir finally felt peace begin to return.